everyone, this is Angela at beginninggenealogist.com. I hope you're having a good day today. Today I'd like to share some information and pass along a suggestion to those of you who are researching families of African American ancestry. Whether you are of African ancestry yourself or you have taken on clients who are of African American ancestry, there are, as you already know, some basic steps that have been very well outlined by researchers such as D. Palmer Woodhor, who's written a wonderful book called Finding a Place Called Home. In addition, of course, many of you are very familiar with the works of noted genealogist Tony Burroughs, whose book, Black Roots, has certainly gotten many individuals started in the right direction. But I have come to realize there are a good number of people who are researching African American families who have missed a critical story in the family history. So today, let's talk about the missing story. Among some of the basic steps that have been recommended, basically I'm talking about oral history, talking to those elders and talking to them often. Of course, one at one point will move from the oral history and start to look and collect those documents and items from the family archives, those artifacts that will be really, really critical, whether they're old photographs, letters, diaries, old insurance papers, deeds, yearbooks, and the list can go on and on and on. And don't forget those funeral programs and obituary clippings that many people tend to collect as well, that are sometimes right in the family archives. So before you say we don't have an archives, look again. Chances are you really do. But at some point you then will move on to collecting records, whether they're vital records. Of course, vital records are birth, marriage, and death records. And of course, we cannot overlook the federal census. In less than a year, we're all excited that 1940 census is about to appear. And a note for the wise, it's going to all be online this time next year. So we're all looking forward to that. But with census records, you know very easily you're going to set at least the goal for yourself to trace the family back through the census, at least back to 1870, if they were enslaved. If they were free people of color, then chances are you can go back much further using census records as well. But if your ancestors were enslaved in particular, it's going to be really critical at some point after getting your family to 1870 that one identifies the last known slave owner. That's a process that can take a very long time, but once one is able to identify the slave owner, one must commit the research to researching the slaveholder's history the same way one will research their own family. It's very, very critical to do that. And at some point in time, by going back through those records in the mid-19th century into the 18th century and beyond if possible, one hopes to be able to find the earliest ancestor, the earliest African ancestor in America. These are known steps. Many people can recite those steps, the 6 basic steps, or 7, depending upon how you choose to present them. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the missing story. So, what's the missing story, you might ask? Well, stop, and I want you to think about something. You've meticulously documented your family from 1930, 1920, 1910, you go on back in time, you're in the 1880s, and you get to 1870, and then what happens? You hit the wall. Okay, well what about 1860? First of all, you want to check 1860, because sometimes people don't know that some ancestors had been free people prior to that time and might be enumerated in the records. But if they were enslaved, you should still check 1860 anyway to see what is there. But stop. 1860, you might not find them. 1870, there they are. 1860, they were enslaved. Slave schedules don't help you. They have no names, only age, complexion, and gender. So you don't see them. But 1870, they're there. So in 1 year, at the beginning of a decade, they were enslaved. At the end of that decade, they were no longer enslaved. Well, what's the logical story that's missing? The freedom story. How did the family go from being enslaved to together as a family, as free people, and being enumerated? Now, yes, we know there was a civil war. Yes, slaves were freed in many cases after the Civil War. Yes, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished slavery. We know that. You're telling your family story. So, what's missing? Your family's story of freedom. How did it happen to your family? Was someone manumitted? Did they happen to make an escape? Did they come as contrabands of war? Did individuals enlist in the Union Army? What happened? And how do you find the answers? Well, actually, there are documents that will help you to tell that missing story. The story of how freedom came. So what kind of records are we going to use to tell that story? Obviously, we're talking about a time span, and I always say we're not talking between 1865 and 1870. No. We're talking about the years between 1860 and 1870. But before that, I also want you to think about American history. You know, I say a lot of times, you cannot practice genealogy in a vacuum. In other words, you're not just collecting names. You're here to tell a story. Well, you've got to connect your family to what was going on in the country. What happened in the late 1850s that might have set a tone for what was going to happen over the next 5 or 6 years? Well, there was the Fugitive Slave Law, Dred Scott decision. There was a certain raid that took place in Harper's Ferry. And some of these efforts were also contributing to a larger sentiment of abolitionist activity. Were there abolitionists in the community where your ancestors lived? You can only answer that. And I say that particularly because I hope that you, and I say that in particular because I hope that you have started to study the local history where your family lived as well. Again, you can't practice genealogy in a vacuum. Start to read what was happening in the community. You might be surprised to find something. I have a family line from Northwest Arkansas, and I was very, very surprised when I began to research one line. And one of my ancestors, it turned out that she was freed pretty early before the end of the Civil War. And that is primarily because in the region where she lived in Northwest Arkansas, there were abolitionist sentiments. Now, it did not necessarily mean that she was freed or manumitted by an abolitionist. That's not necessarily what happened. In fact, that is not what happened. But because there were some sympathies not to be completely supportive of the decision that the state of Arkansas made to secede, there were individuals who had decided, no, we're not that enthusiastic about secession. And in fact, one will be surprised to find there were quite a few Union regiments that were organized in Arkansas. And I'm not talking only about the Black Union Army regiments. There were some Arkansas white Union regiments that were organized as well. So it's important to learn that local history. But beyond that, there are other sources of data to find. And I'm finding them, they come out of that same time period. Civil War era records, including military records, including the fact that I found an ancestor, Lydia, who was allowed to marry a young man who was also enslaved. He happened to have been enslaved by Isaac Walton Talkington, who was a major county clerk in the area, who was not leaning towards secessionist sympathies. And in fact, when certain things were happening, he even allowed his slave, John Talkington, to enlist when the opportunity came to go and join the United States colored troops. And at that time, in fact, this was before 1863, he joined the 2nd Kansas Colored, which was organized very early in the war. Well, it's also interesting to take note of the fact that just by learning that local history, I was picking up some additional information. Now, her husband actually died in Jenkins Ferry battle, but I was able to find out some more information when I got a Civil War widow's pension file. I found out when they married. I also learned some information on the fact that she was married, she was freed early. When he came back through the area, he came, collected her, took her to the city, bought her a small cooking stove. In fact, this is a story that I'll never see in a census record. And she talked about the fact that they had set up house together in the town. At this point, the area was occupied by Union soldiers. And we tend to forget sometimes that war can disrupt the standard order of things in so many ways. And it did. So this is one of those stories I was able to extract. Well, there are other stories to be able to find. There are stories that one can find from Reconstruction Era records, one can find from other records, particularly one can get glimpses of what happened to other family members, sometimes even by following general regimental records that were being created when there was occupation of a Union battalion in that region, and one can find some interesting stories and some interesting anecdotes. One of the richest sources of data, also a Reconstruction Era data, are the records that come from Record Group 105. That is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. We know it to be the Freedmen's Bureau. Well, I recommend that individuals look at those records. Do you know that there were several dozen field offices in every state where there was a Freedmen's Bureau? And you might be surprised. There could have been right in your community, especially if your ancestors lived in a county seat or near the county seat. Possibilities are that there was a field office of the Freedmen's Bureau. Another source of rich data, also from the Reconstruction Era, comes from Freedman savings records. And that could be an entire video in terms of how to utilize Freedman savings records. Not to be confused with Freedmen's Bureau. They're two different record sets, two different entities entirely, but wonderful sources of data. And then, of course, I recommend that individuals pay attention, close attention, to the official records. I'm referring to the official records of the Union and Confederate armies, where they actually give narrative to what happened in a particular time, and particularly when there was a conflict between Union and Confederate armies, there's a Union line. And if there were slaves who lived nearby, word had started as early as 1861. You know, General Benjamin Butler arrived in Virginia in the spring of 61. Literally, he arrived on one day, and 3 men arrived the next day who sought refuge at Fort Monroe. These men were the Rosa Parks of their day, because they started a trend where hundreds and hundreds, in fact, within less than a month, at least 1,000 refugees had occupied Fort Monroe, were taking refuge there, and by the middle to the latter part of that year, word had reached as far south as the Gulf of Mexico. What was the word? Get to the Union line. When you start to read those pension files, you'll find the details of what happened when the raid took place in a community. I was able to find out what happened on one of my lines from Mississippi. And my ancestor talked about what happened when the raid came, the men left, and the woman who was a widow said, well, some of us young ladies, we left the same night. We left the same night. I hope you hear that. She's telling you the moment she joined that entire revolution of people who were later classified as contrabands, but when they essentially freed themselves, they left. And of course, opportunity was there. Understand, this was time of war. There was no one to contain them anymore. Slave owners were no longer present. Overseers were no longer present because they had enlisted in the Confederate Army. Individuals who would have maintained life as it was were no longer in place. And when the opportunity came for freedom, thousands seized that opportunity. This is one of those stories of resistance, and it's a critical story. If you don't find your ancestors in 1860, you see them in 1870. The missing story is how freedom came. And that, even before you identify the slave owner or the last known slave owner, the missing story of how freedom came should be your goal. I'm going to post some links for you in the description box right below in terms of how you can start to find some of those answers and incorporate that story into your family's story. Anyway, I hope that's been helpful. Thanks a lot for your time. This is Angela, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.